to Lunchtime Live with Colton and Brandon. We actually have a newcomer to the scene. Colton was here last time, but I don't recognize this guy. No beard. Yeah, so the last time we met, it was kind of our premiere. We talked for about 30 minutes. We had quite a few people on. So I don't know if anybody from the last time is on now, but what we did is basically just talked about a subject which we have now, and it is something we can take questions. Feel free to open questions up at any time. You can put them in the message box, in-call messages, and we'll see what we can get them answered, how we can get them answered. So yeah, we've got the first one from Anda. What is shift left?
There we go. Make sure we don't get that horrible, awesome Zoom echo there. But yeah, so today, right, we want to cover things that we can do to prevent code breakages in our applications. Any questions related to that? So Anda's coming out right out the gate. I love it. What is shift left? So good question. So shift left is a term that's coming up and becoming more and more popular with QA and testing. Basically, the principle is getting QA involved earlier, right? So they say shift left basically in the sense that, you know, you start from the left, go to the right. So shifting left just means let's get QA involved a little bit earlier in the process. And that really improves the efficiency of the testing and actually helps prevent a lot of the bugs that the QA is going to find in the first place. And the way that works is you're getting them involved earlier in the sense of QA is involved when you're writing your tickets, when you're creating your user stories. They're involved with the developers as they're planning out the tickets and creating their tasks. They're involved with the developers as they're writing their own unit tests to test the code locally. And what that does, right, is since they're involved at the beginning, instead of like a project manager or a product owner working with the development team, building out a ticket, building out the acceptance criteria, and then you're handing it off to someone else, like a QA engineer in this scenario, to test it. Since you have that miss or a gap, maybe what the QA sees as a pass or a fail isn't exactly what the team planned out. Or maybe the QA is really good at finding those edge cases and really understanding all the different scenarios, and they're really good, right? Because they're QA, they're trained in finding all of these edge cases and finding these bugs. And so what will happen is if the QA is not involved at the beginning, by the time, you know, the team plans it, they think they've got everything covered, they kick it to QA finds all these issues, kicks it back. Well, instead of having to go through that whole cycle and kicking it all the way down to QA and kicking it back, what you do is you just have the QA involved at the beginning. So as we're building that ticket out and we're trying to cover all the different cases and scenarios, the QA is involved in that conversation, so they can point out all of those different edge cases. And then that way, it's all laid out in the ticket and everyone's understanding of what needs to be covered. And then when it gets to the QA, they've already covered all those cases, and now the QA will hopefully, right, not catch anything else, and they can pass that ticket on, and that's going to pretty much double your speed in what you can deliver on the development side.
Yeah, so just to add to that, because Colton, as you probably know, is more on the technical side, which is why he's here. I'm here more on the business or sales side. And so when I consider shift left on the business end, and if we're talking about more of a lean kind of startup methodology, the way that helps a business is you're actually going to, there's actually less risk to the entire process. So the faster we can deploy something and test it and have some results for that, obviously you're going to fix things sooner. So there's a cost to that. And so on the business end of it, it's actually more cost inhibitive or cost effective. We'll say effective. Colin's going to share the good words with me. But yeah, I think for the business end of it, definitely more cost effective.
Awesome. So hopefully that answered your question. Let me know, follow up in the chat if there's anything else, if we didn't cover anything.
Yeah, we do have a couple more questions here. One I think came from the QA part of that, which is automated QA testing better than manual to help with code breakages?
It's a good question. So there's kind of there's pros and cons to both. I think, when you're looking at manual QA, you're going to be able to cover more like user scenarios than you would ever you'd be able to catch with automation. You are able to cover a lot of user engagement type items with automation, but typically it's just a lot easier to find things with manual, as far as maybe transition not working correctly, or something's some visual items are broken. Whereas automation, obviously, the main pro of automation is you automate it, so you don't have to, once you create that script and you've got it automated, you don't need to spend all those man hours of going through and testing it again. You could just run that script and it catches it. But with QA automation, the quick way to do automation is really testing like really functional type items, right? Testing, if I enter this form, do I get a certain response back? So to really build in that user scenario with QA automation, it takes a lot of time to write a lot of different scripts out. So I would say they both have pros and cons. Typically with any application, you'd want to do both. Manual QA is really helpful when you're testing a specific like new feature, new ticket, right? So if I'm pushing new code to my application, I'm going to want manual QA to go through that new code or that new feature to make sure everything's covered, we're not missing anything, test all the different use cases. And then automation is really good for doing like full regression testing. And then for anyone that doesn't know what regression testing is, that's basically just testing things that have been completed in the past and make sure that's continuously tested over and over again, right? So maybe we're building out an application. We've got feature 1 that we built. We test feature 2. We test that one, feature 3. And so ultimately, most of the time, if you're going to have bugs, it's going to be in the new code that you're pushing. But sometimes when you push a new feature, it can affect an old feature and can break that old feature. Well, the issue with manual testing is you can't expect someone to go through and test the entire application manually every single time you push some code. So that's where those two things really come together to really cover that full suite. Is you want to build those scripts out to do your full regression suite that you can run every time you push any kind of code that tests all of your old and existing code. And then your manual testing, the majority of what you want to do for your manual testing is testing that new code. So I would say, I wouldn't really say one's better than the other. Maybe automated testing's maybe a little bit more helpful because your average person can do a lot of manual testing. But ultimately, I think the best way to really cover all your bases is to have a good mixture of both, automated testing existing function and features, and then manual testing being more focused on testing those new features.
Awesome. Yeah. Now there was a question that came from Jacob that said, is that where MVPs come in? And so I think that was at a certain point.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you could elaborate on that question a little bit more.
Yeah, so you took talking about QA into the lean startup method. So where do MVPs fall into that lean startup?
Kind of like agile is to development what lean startup is to startups, but not only startups, it's also for corporations, right? So if you're in a department and you're building a product or you're building some sort of service, that also falls under the lean startup umbrella, and you can use those principles and methodologies in either one of those scenarios. So an MVP, which is a minimum viable product, is basically the minimum that you can build in the case of software. It's the minimum that you would build to either get to say revenue, or if it's not revenue, maybe you're only building something to get users. But it's essentially the minimum amount that you would build to get to that first milestone or that first goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And anybody feel free to join in and do audio as well, just like Jacob.
So yeah, I don't know. Did that answer your question, Jake?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Great. So another question Isaiah had was, how can CI/CD help my code breakages?
Awesome. Good question. So for anyone that's not familiar with CI/CD, that refers to continuous integration, continuous development, or deployment. Looks like I need a refresher as well. So basically, putting that simply, that just means instead of, kind of the more old-fashioned method of working on a large feature for maybe, weeks or even months at a time, and then releasing this huge, large feature to the public, what is really taking the storm and really getting more and more popular is making very small changes and pushing very frequently and testing frequently. So again, kind of going old school method, what would happen is, developers would make pushes and they would get tested, but ultimately they would push out in big chunks. So they would get a feature done, they would push that out, and there would be a whole round of testing, and there'd be really this large life cycle of 2, 3, 4 weeks of coding, and then it would be 1 or 2 weeks of testing, kick it back, and it would just take a very long time. But I mean, at the end, you would get this large feature pushed out to your end users. But what they found is that when you do it that way, you're really opening yourself up for introducing a lot of variables into something, right? So if you have a large feature and you've got 1,000 lines of code pushed, those 1,000 lines of code could touch 20 different things inside the application, could affect 20 other features, 20 different users. There's so many variables you're opening up, and it really compounds your QA cycle there. So what CI/CD basically introduces is you push as small of features as possible, or even code pieces as possible. So then it makes it much faster to test, right? So if I push out a full feature to a QA, they got to go through maybe in different users and try all these different scenarios. But if I just push out one little small thing, right? I push out maybe a small text field. I push out one little small button. I push out one little, text change. They can go in, test it, kick it over, and get it done real quick. So it speeds up the testing, and it also helps us zero in on issues much faster too. So if I made one change to one thing and I kick that over and there's a bug, I now know immediately it was that one push that made that bug. If I have, if I do a bunch of merges from multiple developers and then we get a bug, we don't know exactly where that bug came from, right? We're gonna have to go through and look at all the code from all the different developers, and look at all these different places and revert all this code and kind of cycle back. But if I'm having everyone make small pushes and I test as soon as they push their code, it's going to help me identify that much quicker. So that's getting really, really popular. And it just, again, to help my code breakages, as you had asked, you might find more breakages, but you're going to find them much faster, and you're going to be able to identify and debug them much quicker and roll those back and get it kicked back into production a lot faster. And the other thing, not to drag this out too much, but the big thing is it helps get small incremental changes to your users much faster, which is always a value, right? Users would much rather have small incremental changes and updates to your product than wait, months at a time for new updates. I don't know if you have
Yeah. There's actually a lot of parallels between Agile and Lean, and if you don't know, or if you don't know the origin of that, Toyota Manufacturing basically created this Lean model, which I won't go into, but from that came Lean manufacturing, which is basically kind of that assembly line where things were done more quickly, more effectively, efficiently. And so they took that model into Lean manufacturing, and you probably might have heard of the Shingo Award, which is pretty popular. A lot of manufacturing companies try to get the Shingo Award every year, but they actually took that model and turned it into Lean Startup for startup companies. And then Agile was also a product of Lean manufacturing. So it all kind of fits in together. The parallel to CI/CD in Lean Startup is basically the build, measure, learn, cycle. So you're building, just like Colton said, as quickly as possible, You're building features, you're building even parts of your business, or finding ways to optimize your business so you can quickly build something and get on to the next thing. But the most important part of that is to build and then measure it. That measure and that testing will give you the knowledge to move on to the next thing. If it's working, great. If not, you may make some sort of small or even large pivot. So that's kind of the parallelism there.
That's awesome. Hopefully that answered that question for you.
It's a long answer.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else do we have?
We got Jackson.
Yeah, Jackson asked, what's a good QA to developer ratio?
Ooh, nice. Very good question. Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sure depending on who you talk to, you might find different answers. What we've found locally here, at ZipTech is we have found that one QA can do manual testing for up to 4 developers. And that's pretty much where you start kind of getting depreciating returns if you go beyond 4. They really can only handle 4 at a manual QA level. So that means strictly they're just getting the tickets, they go through and they do manual testing. If we want them to also be able to do the automation, so they can write those scripts out, so we can have build out a regression suite that we can run, we have found that we like to have a ratio of 1 QA to 2 developers. Now, with that being said, there's other variables, and things to take into consideration. When I say 4 developers, typically that means more, maybe you have a web application and you have 2 front-end developers, 2 back-end developers, or maybe 4 full-stack developers. But if you have a team of 4 developers, but maybe you're working on a mobile application, a tablet application, and a web application with those 4 developers, you'd probably want to up that ratio a little bit. Maybe add a second QA into that. As you introduce more platforms and again more variables, that's just going to add time for the QA. So it is kind of like a moving target. Some things you have to change. There isn't always a perfect science, but ultimately, what we kind of start off with, I guess, is a 1 to 4 ratio for manual testing and a 1 to 2 ratio for full automation and manual testing.
Yeah, I think that answers it pretty well. We'll get to another question here from Alexandria. For code reviews before a push, is having a tech lead versus peer review better?
Awesome. Yeah, good question. I would say depends on the team. It goes from team to team. If you've got a pretty solid, senior team, maybe a team that's worked together for a while, or you've got a team that's pretty equal in experience, peer reviews work great. It doesn't matter how long you've been programming or how long you've been a developer. It's always good to have someone else come in and do a peer review for you. We do that as a standard at a minimum. We always make sure we're doing peer reviews when we do code pushes. It's basically just like proofreading, right? Like if you're going to write something out, maybe you're going to write some really important, email that you're going to send out. You might want your coworker to take a look at that for you, right? Make sure you're not saying anything silly or it sounds, it sounds weird, or maybe you missed a comma, right? Kind of the same thing for programming. So if you have a team, again, like I said, if you've got kind of a balanced team with experience level and everything, peer reviews work great. If you've got more junior developers on your team, or maybe you've got certain skill sets that don't match up, then I would strongly, push for a tech lead to do the code review of certain individuals, right? Maybe you've got some senior guys on your team and some junior guys on your team. Excuse me. You can have some of the senior guys review the junior guys' code, but typically I probably wouldn't want junior guys to review, other junior developers' codes. So that's when you'd want to have a tech lead do that review. And then, at the end of the day, if you're doing some push and it's for a large feature, it's really important. Maybe you can, ultimately you could do both. You can do a peer review and then have a tech lead do the final review for that code review before I push. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think ultimately if you don't have if you're a little bit smaller of a company, then maybe you could find people that could help you out with that. I think it's good, even if it's like mentors or things like that. to have somebody within the organization that could do those. So we are kind of pushing the time here. We've got a couple other questions, so we'll just jump to those. Hunter asked, should I follow a schedule for CI/CD or just when something is done, you push?
Good question. Typically what we want to do is we want to push daily if we can, even less than that if you can, but yeah. So, I mean, I guess the way to answer that is when you have something done, you can push. You just want to have as many commits in there as possible, so you can have those small integrations there. But ultimately, like as far as the schedule goes, we push to have everyone kind of wrap up what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, so that way we don't have branches open for more than one day. The longer a branch is open, the more prone you are to having merge conflicts. And so again, kind of depends on the team, depends on what we're working on. But ultimately, if you have something that's finished and you can push it, we'll ultimately have the team do that. So we can have 4 or 5 code commits from a single developer in a day, and then we try to, again, like I said, have a minimum of 1 per day.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's kind of fluid, but I think if you don't have a goal in mind and some sort of set schedule, there can be a lot of delays. So while maybe that's a little bit fluid in that, something comes up and you have to change the time, that's with anything, right? With any type of goal or set milestone that you have. You definitely should have something laid out in terms of timeline and try to adhere to that as much as possible. But I guess also allow for some sort of flexibility within that system. So back to Jacob, does having more full stack developers result in less breakages? And then kind of a follow-up to that is, or is there more value in having engineers that specialize in FE and BE?
Yeah, very good question. Assuming FE and BE is front end and back end. Yeah, good question. I mean, in my experience, I would say having full stack developers would have a slightly lower chance of having code breakages because there's less handoffs. One person can work on an entire feature set by themselves, right? And so ultimately, you have less handoffs. You have less people interacting with each other's code, which is going to generally result in less breakages. And so specifically talking about code breakages, I would say, yeah, there's probably a pro to having full stack engineers. And then as far as having front end and back end engineers, the pro to that is, again, in my experience and in my opinion, I believe that having them specialize in front end and back end is more efficient in the overall, because ultimately everybody is somewhat more right-brained or left-brained, right? Some people are more creative and better, with front-end related tasks, right? Creating that UI, having that attention to detail with coloring and spacing and all of those types of items. And then there's people that are more, their brain works better for back end, right? They're more analytical. They're better with, working with data. They're better on the server side. Even if you have a great full stack engineer that's really solid at both front end and back end, he or she's going to have a strength and be stronger on one of those, right? So ultimately, if I have 2 full stack engineers, they're both great, but one's a little bit better at front end and one's a little bit better at back end. If I allow them to just fully focus on what's more natural for them, we could be more efficient in that way. And it helps you with, it helps with resourcing teams and hiring for developers as well. Trying to find those kind of unicorns out there that are, amazing at front end and back end can be really, really difficult. And so being able to have your team set up in a way where you can handle and manage front end developers and back end developers really makes it easy to scale the team and really lets people, flourish in their skill sets. Let me see. And it looks like Jake had a follow-up to it.
Comment
Awesome.
to that.
So the question is, I assume that this is where shifting left comes in and enhances the precision of software development, regardless of full stack or FEBE talent. Yeah, so I mean, that's a great way, bringing the shift left kind of ties in with that as well, right? So we can when we have these stand-up meetings and these planning meetings, when we're getting the tickets ready before they move into development, we want to have that full team involved, right? So that's, again, where we say we want to have the QA involved at the beginning to help bridge all those gaps, right? So we have a front-end developer that's really focused on the front-end pieces. We have a back-end developer that's focused on the back-end pieces. They make sure that everything's being considered and handled on what needs to be done to complete this feature. And now you've got the QA involved to make sure that all the test cases that they're going to run, all the scenarios that they want to run and cover are all included in this planning session. And then obviously you've got like the product owner involved in that as well to make sure that are we covering everything that's needed for the product and for the end user. So you get all of these opinions from all of these different points of view and all these specialists that all want to cover their piece of the puzzle. You make sure that that's all included during the planning, again, shifting left, before the development started. That way, when we get into development, everything's covered, everyone's on the same page, and we're really seeing it from every viewpoint and every angle. Pretty much at any time, you want to get as many people involved as possible or different viewpoints of it involved as possible during the planning session, to avoid any issues down the road, right? If you have one person plan something out, no matter how good they are, they're probably not going to see it from a different angle that someone else is, and going to see like a flaw in the plan or something missing in the plan. So that's why we want to have everybody involved up front and in that planning session. And again, kind of circles back into the front end, back end. If you've got someone full stack, they're trying to cover all the scenarios, but if you've got them split into front end and back end, they can really focus in on their sections, right? The front end guys really focused in on front end, and then the back end, engineers really focused in on the back end.
Yeah, so we at ZipTech, kind of two divisions of or types of clients that come through the door. Number one, startups, and then two, we classify as staff augmentation, or companies that already have some sort of technology. Maybe it's a team or one person that's kind of running the IT department. It really depends on the type of company, your budgets, what exactly you're going to do with that, whether, and speaking directly to kind of front end, back end scenario. If you're a startup, you might be more cost conscious, your budget may be smaller, maybe you're self-funded or working with, maybe some smaller investment group or something. They could want you to just do a full stack developer. But really what we found is that more front end, back end specialist scenario is going to be much better. And that leads me kind of to the concept of accountability. Like if you're a startup, I completely understand the bootstrap scenario where you're just trying to do whatever you can to build that company. But it does come down to a lot of accountability and being honest with yourself. What is it we really want to build, or what are we trying to accomplish here? And do we have the funds to do that? If not, there's alternative ways to build and get to that kind of goal that you're looking to get to. But if you're an established company, you really kind of have to also be accountable and honest with yourself about budgets. And we kind of sit in the middle of the road in terms of, and let's get a little bit more specifically into ZipTech, but we're not the cheapest out there, I guess you could say, and we're not as much as local developers or US-based developers. So we kind of fit in that middle ground where we're helping people almost do a 2-for-1, 2 developers for one. So if you do front end, back end, there's a huge benefit to doing that and using our model for that purpose. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. And it looks like we're kind of at the end of the road here. Anything else you have?
Yeah. No, hopefully that answers everyone's questions. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to submit them, and we can always follow up with everybody after the call and answer any questions you have, or feel free to jump on our next meeting that we're going to have. Not sure what topic we're going to cover yet, but we'll definitely have another one next month.
Oh, any suggestions? Let us know.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.